Aloha. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about more complex structures in the skull where gatherings of bones make these certain structures that help to carry out certain functions. So in terms of let's talk about the orbital complex. So when you think of something orbiting something, like you might think of like a satellite or the moon orbits the Earth. What does it mean? It kind of circles around the Earth and travels around this whole circumference of the Earth. Well, in terms of your orbital complex, instead of the globe, it is orbiting your eye. So where does your eye sit? It sits in the orbital complex. And this entire structure right here, that's your orbital complex. So that bony structure that helps to keep your eyes in place, but also shield your eyes because if anything like if any try flies at your eye and something hard, and then maybe your bones of your orbital complex will help to prevent your eye from sustaining trauma and damage. And sometimes, like, I think this once in a while, in the background when the YouTube videos have like ads and they say orbital bone for some of these makeup people, and they're probably referring to this orbital complex, so basically the area around your eye. Okay, so what is the orbital complex? It's its entire part, so it's not a singular bone, but it's made out of multiple bones. So what are the bones? Well, you have the zygomatic, your cheekbone, your frontal bone, your maxilla, so and then you have your sphenoid, and the sphenoid again, the front part, the anterior part right here is smooth because this is going to be facing the inside where your eye would sit. So the sphenoid, this part is smooth. Then we also have the palatine, that small little one right here. Even though it's just that tiny one peeking out, it's still considered part of the complex. It's part of that smooth structure. Yeah, the palatine, your ethmoid, and your lacrimal bones. So these together make your orbital complex. And if you look at these, there's also all these notches, these grooves, these little holes, because you have a ton of blood vessels and nerves and arteries and veins that run through your not only the skull, but they also emerge at the surface of the skull right here, and they travel around the eye and the optic canal. This carries the nerves that help to uh, the eye carry the signals from your eye and to your brain, the occipital lobes, so that leads to your sense of sight slash vision. So there's a lot of things. Remember that if there's a hole or depression, if it doesn't it fits something into it typically. Okay, though there's another complex called the nasal complex, and this was a little more, I guess, a little more detailed, I should say. And then, so what is the nasal complex? So the nasal cavity, so pretty much that space inside that leads from when you breathe in air, it passes through that nasal cavity before it ends up into your airways below that. Then you also have your paranasal sinuses. So these are the pockets of open, so they're not solid bones. They're actually little pockets within these bones. So they're not completely solid. And so the nasal cavity plus all these little pockets, and you kind of see the nasal sinuses and cross section here as well. And that's your nasal complex. Now, this is a little section of another image, and in the slides, if you're taking my class, you see the full image. But here we have like so what they did is take someone's I know it's a pretty graphic one, but it illustrates the nasal cavity, I think, very well. So they took it and they sliced like this. So what you're seeing is actually a slice through, like not just the nose, but just like further behind it. So you can kind of get all the nasal conchae. So the ethmoid is dangling down here. This would be the perpendicular plate. And then you have the vomer that forms this bottom part. So the wall right here is what you call the nasal septum. So the nasal septum is dividing your nasal cavity into left and right. Now then you have the superior nasal concha, which are extensions of the ethmoid, along with the inferior nasal concha, or not inferior, but middle nasal concha. The middle nasal concha is an extension of the ethmoid as well. But look at the inferior nasal concha. Now, are they extensions of the ethmoid? Notice that they're coming off from the sides instead of dangling from the ethmoid. So the inferior nasal conchae are their own structures. And then you have between the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, you have the superior meatus. So this is like one of the way multiple pathways air. When you breathe in through your nose or breathe out through your nose, it can pass through that. But there's other passageways, like between the middle and the inferior, you have the middle meatus. And between the inferior nasal concha and the hard palate, you have the inferior meatus. So you have all these things that are complex, but why are they so complex and detail and intricate, and they're not just like simple structures. Well, the thing is that, and here's another thing I learned from Dr. Cummins, like an easy way, quick and dirty way to draw the nasal cavity and how the struct bones are. So the ethmoid is the upper part right here, and it forms the upper roof of the nasal cavity as well. The vomer helps to divide it, that so it's the bottom part right there that helps to form that nasal septum. But they also have the hard palate. Then you have the superior nasal conchae, which extend off the ethmoid. You also have the middle nasal conchae, which extend off the ethmoid as well. But you have the inferior nasal concha that are not part of that ethmoid, so they're our own bone. So what's the whole purpose and why are they that kind of spiral shape is because when you breathe in air through your nose, it is going to make that air turbulent. Basically, turbulent, so we're just talking about something swirling around. It's like air turbulence. What happens if we're flying in a plane and all of a sudden you hit turbulence. It gets really shaky, right? And that's because all the air is being no longer just like gliding smoothly over your wings. It's starting to bump and have all these eddies and whatnot. So that's what these, then that's also why they also call the nasal conchae. They also call them turbinates. So why do you want to make the air turbulent? Well, this actually slows the passage of air as it goes through your nose and before it enters your airways. But it also, you have all these like hairs, you have this mucus that helps to trap like things like dust or things that can cause disease. And you can, and it, if you, have you ever like be in a really cold environment and just breathe air straight into your through your mouth into your airways, it kind of hurts. So the cool thing is about, or I should say, the warm thing about the needles conchae is that they help warm air before it actually enters your body. So if you, assuming you're breathing through your nose. And yeah, so the thing about that, and also that kind of swirling, the more it kind of swirls, anything that can be trapped by mucus or hairs can be trapped with all this increased surface area and that flow that kind of like pushes this, all the air particles and whatever comes along for the ride through the nasal cavity with along with it. All right, so then the nasal cavity itself, this is this room right here, and this passageway, and we're seeing only half of it right here, but here's the sinuses. Now, this is looking at the sagittal view. And if we look at the front of it, so the main sinuses, you have the frontal sinuses in the frontal bone, the sphenoidal sinuses in the sphenoid bone, and the maxillary sinuses in that upper part of your face, or I should say, like this front part of the face and upper part of your jaw, that is your maxillary sinus. And then you also have these ethmoid air cells, and it's a little hard to see, but they're compared to a big old sinus, they have like these multiple little pockets in the ethmoid. Now, again, I'm censoring this because of YouTube, because YouTube, I think they have some filter to detect graphic things. So to keep this video like so that you don't have to like sign in and say you're 18 plus. So that's why it looks this way. But if you're taking my class and you have the full picture of this, you see that there's all these pockets right here in the bone. So these are your sinuses, or it's like that's some of the sinuses you find in your in your nasal complex. All right, so what happens? Like everyone's gone sick at one point in time. You got some sort of respiratory infection and nasal infection, and if you get infection and what is called something called inflammation of your sinuses, you get something called sinusitis. Now, sinusitis, well, a healthy sinus, it is these, and notice that they're all leading toward the nose. And why do you blow your nose when you feel this kind of like pressure in your nose and you feel like you have to blow out all this mucus and it feels like sometimes it feels like it might be itchy as well. Well, a healthy sinus should look like this. It should be open. It shouldn't have too much mucus. It shouldn't be inflamed. But if you have a sinusitis, notice that this looks very red, it looks very swollen, and the thing is that it's also carrying a lot of blood vessels, and also it increases the production of mucus in the sinus. So that's why it might feel like the sinus mucus is just constantly coming out, or it feels like it's plugged up with mucus and you're just trying everything to get it out. So that is why you have the sinusitis. Now, it can be caused by like an infection, but it can also be caused by like sometimes the allergens can cause sinusitis if it inflames things enough. So how can you alleviate and relieve your sinusitis? Well, one thing you can take, they are decongestants and pseudoephedrine. So this is one. where so this one you have to kind of ask the pharmacist. They don't have it out in the open, and because like and I remember like when I was living in San Francisco, one of my fellow grad students like she had a really bad cold and she's like, "Can you buy me these decongestant pseudoephedrine because I already bought my maximum." And they actually have to like at least when I was there, they actually have to take your driver's license and ID, so you're only allowed a little because supposedly some grandma was buying up 40 boxes of pseudoephedrine and using it to make other illicit things, or allegedly. But yeah, that's why they start cracking down on that. But pseudoephedrine, back to decongestants. So what they do is that they help to relieve that sinusitis. And then phenylephrine, now this isn't the ones that you don't need to ask the pharmacist. You can just buy off the shelf. But they did studies that actually doesn't work. And if you ever taken like something with phenylephrine versus pseudoephedrine, yeah, phenylephrine was always weak sauce, and pseudoephedrine, that's the one that had what help with decongesting your sinuses. So what they do is they activate these proteins called alpha-1 adrenergic receptors, and there's the alpha-1 adrenergic there's alpha-1 adrenergic receptors all over in different tissues of your body. But what this is trying to accomplish specifically is target the blood vessels. So your blood vessels have these receptors, and when you have a pseudoephedrine or something that activates these receptors on the blood vessels, it causes them to shrink. So this is going to result in less blood flow to your sinuses and the lining of your sinuses. It's also going to reduce the fluids and mucus that ends up in your sinuses. So this is why you might notice that your mucus gets thinner if you're on these decongestants. All right. So at the end of this, you should be able to describe the general structure of the orbital complex and its bones. And then you describe the structure of the nasal complex, including the nasal cavity, the nasal sinuses, and the bones that make up the nasal complex.